I came home early that Tuesday because I'd forgotten my wallet on the kitchen counter. That was it. No grand plan, no suspicion, nothing dramatic. Just a forgotten wallet and a 20-minute detour that changed the entire trajectory of my life. My name is Daniel Kowalski. I'm 58 years old, recently retired from 26 years as a structural engineer with the city of Edmonton. My wife, Renata, and I had been married for 31 years. We had a daughter named Claire, who was 29, married to a man named Marcus Webb for 4 years. We had a house on the west side of the city, a decent pension, a dog named Biscuit, and what I genuinely believed with my whole chest was a good life. I pulled into the driveway at 11:40 inches the morning. Renata's car was there, which wasn't unusual. She worked part-time at a dental office on Wednesdays and Fridays, and Tuesdays were her days off. Marcus worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, so I'd seen his truck parked on our street before. He and Claire lived 6 blocks away. They came over for dinner most Sundays. He called me Dan. I bought him a Oilers jersey for his birthday last year. I walked in through the side door from the garage. The kitchen was empty. I grabbed my wallet off the counter and was halfway back to the door when I heard something. Voices. Upstairs. I stood still for a moment, one hand on the doorframe. Biscuit was sitting by the patio door, staring at me with a look I can only describe as apologetic. That dog knew things before I did. I walked up the stairs slowly, not because I suspected anything, but because something in the quality of the silence between the sounds felt wrong. Our bedroom door was closed. I turned the handle. I don't need to describe what I saw. I think you already know. The part that I remember most clearly isn't the scene itself, it's the sound Renata made. Not surprise, not fear. A sound of pure irritation, like I had interrupted something she was trying to finish. 31 years of marriage. And that was the sound. Marcus said my name. He actually said Dan, as though I had walked into his house uninvited. I closed the door. I walked back down the stairs. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I stared at the fruit bowl in the middle of it, a wooden bowl Claire had given us for Christmas 2 years ago, and I felt something inside me go completely, utterly quiet. Biscuit came and put his chin on my knee. I sat there for maybe 12 minutes. Then I stood up, walked to the garage, got in my truck, and drove away. I didn't go to a friend's house. I didn't call anyone. I drove to the river valley and sat in a parking lot overlooking the North Saskatchewan for almost 2 hours, watching the current move. At some point I realized I was still holding my wallet. That was the whole reason I had come home. Here is what I decided, sitting in that parking lot. I was not going to explode. I was not going to perform my pain for anyone. I was going to be very, very deliberate about what happened next. The first call I made was to my brother-in-law, Gerald, Renata's own brother, who had never liked Marcus and had told me so at Claire's wedding reception, in a low voice over a glass of rye whiskey. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what I'd seen. There was a long silence. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" That was all. No drama, just that question. Gerald is a good man. The second call I made was to a divorce lawyer named Pauline Tran. A colleague of mine from the city had used her 3 years before. I had her number in my phone for reasons I could never fully explain to myself. Maybe some quiet part of me had been preparing for this longer than I knew. Pauline's assistant gave me an appointment for Thursday morning. I thanked her and hung up. I drove home at 4:30. Marcus's truck was gone. Renata was sitting in the living room, and when I walked in, she stood up with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between guilt and defiance, as if she hadn't quite decided which one would serve her better. I said nothing. I walked past her to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and drank it standing at the sink. She followed me in. She said she was sorry. She said it hadn't meant anything. She said it had only happened a few times. She said she didn't know why. I set the glass down on the counter and looked at her. 31 years. I thought about the drive out to Jasper we took for our 20th anniversary. I thought about the night Claire was born, and how Renata had fallen asleep holding her within minutes, and I had sat in the chair beside the hospital bed, not able to stop smiling. I thought about a Tuesday morning I'd brought her coffee in bed, and she'd said, "You're the best thing that ever happened to me," without even fully waking up. I said, "I heard you," and I went to the guest room. I want to say something here. That night, lying on the guest bed staring at the ceiling, the hardest part was not the anger. Anger I could work with. The hardest part was the specific, detailed quality of the humiliation, not that my wife had been unfaithful, but that she had chosen my son-in-law. The man who sat across from me at Sunday dinner and asked me which router I recommended and watched hockey playoffs in my living room. The man my daughter had married. The betrayal didn't just go through me. It went through my whole family, like a crack running through load-bearing concrete. I know about load-bearing concrete. By the time I met with Pauline on Thursday, I had already done several things very quietly. I had set up the small motion-activated camera I'd bought at Canadian Tire, the kind people use for their front porches, and placed it in the bookshelf in our bedroom facing the door. I'd told Renata I was going out for a walk that morning, and instead I had driven 2 blocks, waited 40 minutes, and driven back. Marcus's truck was in the driveway. I drove past without stopping. I had also taken photographs of our financial documents, transferred digital copies to a USB drive, and left it at Gerald's house. I was calm when I did this, almost clinical. The engineer in me was grateful to have a problem with measurable parameters. Pauline Tran was direct and competent and did not waste my time. She asked what assets we had. I told her, the house, purchased in both our names in 2003, a lake cabin in Lac Suite. And I had inherited from my parents in 2018, which remained titled solely in my name and which I had never commingled into marital funds. A shared investment account, my pension, Renata's partial pension from the dental office. Pauline said the cabin was almost certainly mine to keep. She said the house would be divided. She said my pension, depending on the length of the marriage and the specifics of the Alberta Matrimonial Property Act, would likely be subject to equalization. She gave me realistic numbers. I appreciated that. She also said, "Do you have any documentation of the infidelity?" I told her about the camera. She nodded slowly and said, "Alberta is a no-fault divorce province. Fault doesn't affect the division of property the way it once did. But documentation of the relationship, specifically the relationship with your son-in-law, may become relevant in any subsequent proceedings involving your daughter's own legal situation if she chooses to pursue a divorce. It would also help demonstrate the context of the marriage breakdown." I hadn't thought about Claire yet. Not fully. I had been protecting myself, and I had not yet allowed myself to look in her direction. That night, driving home, I did. My daughter was 29 years old. She had been married for 4 years to a man who had been sleeping with her mother. She didn't know. I was almost certain she didn't know, but I was no longer trusting my certainty about anything. I called her that evening, from my truck, parked outside the house. I asked how she was doing. She said fine, tired. Marcus had been weird lately, but she figured it was a work thing. Her voice was light and ordinary, and I sat in my truck and I thought, how do I do this? How does a person do this? I told her I had something important to talk to her about, and that I wanted to do it in person. She asked if I was okay. I said I was, and that was not entirely a lie. I was intact, which I suppose is its own version of okay. We arranged to meet for lunch Saturday, just the 2 of us. What happened between Thursday and Saturday is the part I don't speak about often. Renata continued to sleep in our bedroom. I continued in the guest room. We had the terrible civilized conversations that happen in houses where something has broken, passing each other the coffee pot, asking if the recycling had gone out, discussing the dog's vet appointment with the practiced mundanity of people performing normalcy for an audience that wasn't there. On Friday afternoon, I left the house and drove to Marcus's truck. He had parked it, as usual, in front of the house 2 doors down, whose owners were spending the winter in Mesa. I pulled up behind it, got out, and knocked on his window. He startled. He rolled it down. I looked at him for a long moment. He was 33 years old. He had a jaw that Claire had once described as stupidly perfect while laughing, back when she was happy with him. He looked, at that moment, like a boy who knew exactly what was coming and had no idea what to do with his hands. I said, "I know everything. I have documentation. What happens next depends on the choices you make in the next 72 hours. If I were you, I would call a lawyer." I drove away. I want to be honest about something. I had thought about other options. I had sat in the guest room for 2 nights, imagining various forms of direct action, the kind that feel satisfying in the imagining and disastrous in the execution. I had thought about confrontations and ultimatums and public humiliations. I had thought about the industrial adhesive I kept in the garage from a renovation project, and what a person might theoretically do with it. and I had actually laughed alone in the dark at 3 in the morning, which I think was the moment I knew I was going to survive this. But I am a structural engineer. I know that the most permanent damage is done not by dramatic sudden force, but by precise, sustained pressure applied to the correct point. Documentation. Lawyers. Silence, where silence was strategic. Speech, where speech was necessary. Saturday lunch with Claire was the hardest hour of my life. We met at a Vietnamese place on White Avenue that she liked. She ordered a bowl of pho. I had tea. She was wearing her hair down, and she looked like she was 22, and I had to work very hard to keep my face ordinary. I told her. I didn't spare details, but I was careful. I told her what I had seen. I told her about the camera. I told her that I had already spoken with a lawyer, and that I was going to file for divorce. I told her that Marcus was aware that I knew. I told her I was sorry. I told her I loved her. I told her that none of this, not one single piece of it, was about her, even though I knew it would feel that way. She sat very still for a long time. Then she picked up her spoon, set it down, picked it up again. She said, "How long?" I said I didn't know for certain. The documentation I had covered the past 3 weeks. I suspected it had been longer. She said, "Does Mom know that you know?" I said yes. She said, "Does she know you're telling me?" I said no. She looked out the window at the street for a while. A city bus went past. When she looked back at me, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. She said, "Okay, thank you for telling me yourself." I drove her home. We sat in the car outside her house for another 20 minutes, not saying much. At one point she put her head on my shoulder the way she used to do when she was small, and I put my arm around her, and we stayed like that until she was ready. That was the moment, not the discovery, not the lawyer's office, not the quiet confrontation in the truck that actually broke something open in me. Because she was my child. She had done nothing. And she was sitting in a car on a Saturday afternoon holding the wreckage of 2 marriages at the age of 29. I have a complicated relationship with the word revenge. I've heard it used about what I did next, and I understand why. But I would call it something else. I would call it accurate accounting. Renata had a close group of friends, women she'd known for 15 to 20 years, who gathered monthly for what they called a supper club. 3 of these women knew me well. 2 had been at our wedding. One, a woman named Barbara Ostrovsky, had actually introduced Renata and me at a mutual friend's party in 1993. I called Barbara. I told her what had happened. Factually, without editorializing. I told her about the camera footage, which at that point showed Marcus entering the house on 4 separate occasions across 12 days. I told her I was filing for divorce. I asked her not to tell Renata I had called, only because I needed another 48 hours before the papers were served. Barbara was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Oh, Danny, I'm so sorry." And then, "She told us you 2 had grown apart. We thought—" She stopped. "Never mind what we thought. Word moves through a community. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know that. I knew exactly how information travels in a circle of women who have been friends for 2 decades. Within 4 days, without me saying another word to anyone, Renata was receiving phone calls from friends she thought were unconditionally in her corner. They weren't unconditional. Turns out integrity has conditions. The papers were served on a Wednesday morning. I had moved into Gerald's spare room the previous Friday. I took Biscuit, my personal files, my laptop, a suitcase of clothes, and the wooden fruit bowl, because it was from Claire, and it was going to stay with me regardless of what any property division said about kitchen items. Renata called me 6 times that Wednesday. I let them all go to voicemail. My lawyer had advised me not to engage directly, and beyond the legal strategy, I simply didn't have anything left to say that wouldn't cost me more than it was worth. The next several weeks moved with the strange, slow velocity of legal proceedings. Renata retained a lawyer. Marcus and Claire formally separated. The camera footage, which I had handed to Pauline on a USB drive in a plain white envelope, did its quiet work in the background of various conversations I was not present for. What I didn't expect was the call I got from Marcus. It was a Sunday evening. I almost didn't pick up, but something made me. He said he was sorry. He said it slowly and carefully, in the voice of someone who has been coached to say something and is now discovering they actually mean it. He said he had made the worst decision of his life. He said he didn't expect forgiveness and wasn't asking for it. He said he thought I deserved to hear it from him directly. I said, "I appreciate you calling. That took something." And I meant it. I'm not a small enough man to pretend I didn't. I also said, "You hurt my daughter. That's the part that won't resolve for me." He said he knew. We hung up. I don't know what became of him after that. I genuinely don't. I chose not to keep tracking. The divorce was finalized 8 months after I walked into that kitchen to retrieve a forgotten wallet. Renata received her share of the house equity and a portion of my pension, as calculated under provincial law. I kept the Lac Sweet Anne cabin. I kept Biscuit. I received a sum in equalization that was fair, which is the most I could say for it. I moved into a rental apartment in Glenora while I decided what came next. It had hardwood floors and tall windows, and a small balcony that looked west over the river valley. On clear evenings I could see the sky go orange and purple over the tree line. I bought a decent coffee maker and some new furniture, and I sat in the quiet of my own space. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something that surprised me with its clarity. Relief. Not happiness, not yet. That came later, slowly, in the organic way that good things tend to come when you stop forcing them. But relief was immediate. The specific physical loosening of a tension I hadn't fully recognized was there until it was gone. Claire came for dinner twice a week through most of that autumn. She was in counseling, which I was glad about. She was practical and sad and funny, in the way that people become when they've survived something hard, finding the absurdity in things, holding it up to the light. She started running. She got a better haircut. She called her lawyer every Monday, and was methodical about her own divorce proceedings. She reminded me of myself, which is the greatest compliment I know how to give. Gerald drove out to the cabin with me in November. We fished for a morning, caught nothing, sat on the dock with hot coffee watching the ice form at the edges of the lake. He told me that Barbara Ostrowski had told him that Renata had left the city to stay with a cousin in Kelowna. I said I hoped she found what she was looking for there. I meant it about 70%, which felt honest. The following March, I signed a contract to do part-time consulting work for a civil engineering firm reviewing bridge assessments, mostly, which suited me perfectly. I went to the gym. I started cooking properly, which I'd always meant to do and never had. I drove out to the cabin most weekends and took Biscuit down to the lakeshore and stood in the cold air and thought about how strange it is. How genuinely strange that the worst thing that happens to you is sometimes also the thing that finally puts you where you were supposed to be. I am 59 now. This is not the life I planned, but I've spent enough years working with structures to know that the buildings that survive aren't always the ones that were designed perfectly. They're the ones that were built with enough integrity to absorb the damage and redistribute the load. I'd like to say a few things to anyone who is sitting somewhere recognizing themselves in this story. Document everything before you say anything. Not because you're building a case against someone, though you may be, but because clarity requires evidence, and grief is not a reliable archivist. Your memory will distort. The record won't. Get a lawyer before you get an audience. I know the instinct is to tell people, to spread the weight of what you're carrying across as many hands as possible. Resist that instinct long enough to protect yourself legally. Everything else can come after. Tell your children the truth, but tell it gently, and tell it yourself, before they hear it from someone else. Your child deserves to hear hard news from the person who loves them most, not from a rumor or a worse version of events. It will cost you. It's still the right thing to do. And understand that rebuilding is not the same as returning. You are not going back to who you were before Tuesday morning. That person is gone. What you are building now is something different, and if you build it carefully, with the same patience you would give to anything worth making, it will be stronger than what stood there before. I drove out to the cabin last weekend. The ice was breaking up on the lake. Biscuit ran the full length of the dock and barked at a goose that was entirely unbothered. I sat in the old Muskoka chair my father had left on the porch, and I drank my coffee and I watched the water move. The betrayal that nearly unmade me was, in the end, the thing that made me look clearly at my own life for the first time in years. That is not a small thing to be given. Even if the giving was cruel, and even if I would have chosen differently, if choosing had been offered. Some gifts arrive in the worst possible wrapping.